Diplomacy at its best is an art of balance. Finely tuned waltz where nations negotiate, extend a hand, and, when necessary, draw a firm line. What we have witnessed over the course of the last few days is not a diplomatic dance. It's a geopolitical collision course. The last confrontation between Washington and Bogota lays bare the truth. The United States, under President Donald Trump's second administration, is opting for not collaboration, but for coercion. Not for negotiation, but for the blunt force of tariffs. Today, we delve into the deepening rift between the United States and Colombia, a country long seen as Washington's steadfast ally in the region. We will analyze the failed deportation flight, retaliatory economic measures, and the lasting implications of this new doctrine of confrontation. But most importantly, we will view this from Bogota, not from Washington, from Latin America's embassies, not from the halls of the White House. The deportation flight that never landed. It began with a rejection. Colombia refused to allow a U.S. military plane loaded with deported migrants to land on its soil. A calculated move by President Gustavo Petro, who, in standing firm, sent a clear message: Colombia is not a subordinate. For decades, Washington has dictated migration policies to governments with little resistance. But Petro made it clear that Colombia would no longer serve as an automatic recipient of Washington's decisions. The significance of this decision cannot be overstated. For years, the deportation agreements have been a diplomatic compliance expectation. Petro's refusal disrupts this pattern. It signals that Latin American nations are reevaluating their positions within a shifting geopolitical retaliation. Tariffs as a diplomatic weapon. Washington, in response, did not seek dialogue or diplomacy. Instead, it deployed one of its most potent economic weapons: tariffs. Effective immediately, Trump imposed a series of trade restrictions on Colombian goods, escalating what has now become an economic standoff. The message was clear: Washington expects obedience, and those who defy it will pay the price. In the lexicon of international affairs, this is known as gunboat diplomacy. Except, in this modern era, the warships have been replaced with financial warfare. Tariffs, visa restrictions, and economic penalties have become tools of coercion, forcing smaller economies into submission. But did Washington miscalculate? The Petro administration did not back down. Instead, Colombia countered with its own retaliatory measures, imposing reciprocal tariffs on U.S. imports up to 50% and deepening economic ties with other markets such as Europe and Asia. This was a tit-for-tat strategy reminiscent of Cold War diplomatic duels. In Washington's view, Petro's actions may appear reckless, an unnecessary provocation against a superpower. But in Latin America, it's seen way differently. For decades, Colombia has been one of the most reliable allies of the United States, receiving security assistance, economic investments, the preferential trade status, and, complete solidarity in this war on drugs that it took on over the course of the last several decades. Trump's transactional approach to foreign policy, where alliances are contingent on absolute compliance, has eroded the goodwill that once underpinned U.S.-Colombian relations. The suspension of visas for Colombian officials, the threats to withdraw economic aid, and the tariffs that serve as reminders that Washington no longer treats allies like partners, but as subordinates or as dependents. This, however, is not a mere policy dispute, it's an emblematic shift. Latin America, long accustomed to operating within Washington's orbit, is beginning to assert itself now. Whether it's through Mexico's defiance on immigration policy or Brazil's growing independence in international trade, a pattern is emerging. The United States can no longer assume automatic deference from its southern neighbor. And this was largely generated by the attitude of its current president, Donald Trump. Washington's heavy-handed tactics are not only reshaping the relationship with Colombia, but they are also sending signals across Latin America. If Trump is willing to turn against Colombia, a country long seen as a strategic partner, what does that mean for the others? For the others in the Americas? This is the nature of foreign policy under the current administration. The logic is clear: dominate or disengage. The goal is not to build coalitions, but to force compliance. This is the approach that, as I said in our previous episode, risks alienating Washington's closest allies. It's this bellicose attitude that doesn't sit well in Latin America. Geopolitical competitors such as China, Russia, and even the European Union are watching very closely. Each diplomatic rupture, each retaliatory tariff, each failed negotiation creates opportunities for these powers to expand their own influence. The economic corridors of Bogota, the strategic ports of Panama, and the energy sectors of Brazil, each is a potential gateway for alternative alliances. So who won and who lost? In Washington, Trump will claim victory. He imposed tariffs, flexed his economic muscle, and demonstrated that defiance carries consequences. But in Bogota, Petro will also claim victory. He defended Colombian sovereignty, stood up to a global superpower, and forced the renegotiation of terms. Therein lies the truth of this new geopolitical era. Victory is subjective. In a world where alliances are shifting and economic warfare is the new norm, the lines between winning and losing are very much blurred. But the real question is, where does this leave the people caught in the middle? The Colombian exporters now facing US tariffs, the small businesses on both sides of the border wondering, so what comes next? The migrants deported in military planes. Some reports even stated that they were being transported in shackles with handcuffs. This is not only a story of presidents and policies, it's a story of lives interrupted, economies destabilized, and an uncertain future. We are in uncharted diplomatic waters, where confrontation has replaced cooperation. The Embassy File will continue to monitor these developments, dissecting the consequences, analyzing the shifting dynamics of power, because this is a new world order. Understanding the game is no longer optional, it's a necessity. This has been the Embassy File and what you need to know. Let's keep analyzing. Most importantly, let's keep collaboration lines open.